I was never supposed to know. I think about that a lot. If I hadn't opened my mouth, if I had just let the moment pass, my family would still be normal. At least, as normal as we pretended to be. But I did open my mouth. And in doing so, I exposed a secret that was never meant to come out. It happened at a family dinner, one of those big, chaotic gatherings where everyone talks over each other, the wine flows a little too freely, and old stories get dragged up for the millionth time. I, 27M, was sitting next to my uncle. Let's call him Mark. Mark has always been the cool uncle. The one who sneaks you a sip of beer when you're a kid, tells the best jokes, and always has some wild story to share. That night, he was telling a story about his teenage years, something about sneaking out of the house, and my mom, his older sister, cut him off with a weird look. "Mark," she said sharply. "Not now." I remember laughing. "Oh, come on, Mom. What, you don't want us to know what a rebel Uncle Mark was?" She gave me this tight smile. The kind that's supposed to shut down a conversation without making a scene. I should have let it go. But I didn't. Instead, I said something I will regret forever. I turned to Mark and, as a joke, I said, "Man, I bet Grandma and Grandpa were relieved when you finally moved out. You were probably their hardest kid." Silence. Immediate, suffocating silence. I thought I had just killed the vibe. That maybe I had accidentally hit some old nerve. But then, my uncle let out this small, breathless laugh and said, "You don't know, do you?" I frowned. "Know what?" I glanced around the table. My mom was pale. My dad wouldn't look at me. My aunt had her lips pressed together like she was physically holding back words. My stomach twisted. "What?" Mark sighed, ran a hand through his hair and said, "I was never supposed to move out. I was kicked out." And just like that, dinner was ruined. The tension in the room was instant and suffocating. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. It was like I had flipped over a rock and exposed something rotting underneath. I looked at my mom. "Kicked out? What is he talking about?" She shook her head quickly. "It's nothing. Just old family stuff. Let it go." But Mark wasn't letting it go. He gave a bitter laugh and took a long sip of his drink before muttering, "Of course she'd say that." Mom's head snapped toward him. "Mark." He ignored her and turned to me. "You really don't know?" "No," I said, my chest tightening. "Nobody ever told me you got kicked out." He let out another sharp laugh. "Figures." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. I always wondered how long they were going to keep up the lie. "Mark, stop." Mom's voice was dangerous now. He met her gaze and smirked. "Or what? You gonna erase me from the family again?" At this point, my heart was pounding. Can someone just tell me what the hell is going on? Mark turned back to me. His expression suddenly unreadable. "You want to know why I was kicked out? Why I suddenly moved away when I was 18 and nobody talked about it again?" I nodded, barely breathing. He exhaled, shaking his head. Then, in a voice that was too calm, too steady, he said, "Because your mom and dad told Grandma and Grandpa that if I didn't leave, they'd cut me out of their lives completely. They gave them a choice. Me or them." My head snapped toward my parents. "Is that true?" My dad shifted uncomfortably, still refusing to look at me. My mom's hands were gripping her napkin so tightly it was shaking. She looked ready to scream. Mark leaned forward. "Ask her why." I did. And that's when my mom finally snapped. She shoved her chair back and stood up so fast the dishes rattled. "Because he's a liar." Mark let out a breathless laugh. "Oh, here we go. You don't know the full story," she spat, voice trembling. "You have no idea what he did." I turned back to Mark, my pulse in my ears. "What did you do?" He smiled, but there was no humor in it. Just something cold. Something exhausted. I fell in love with the wrong person. And just like that, the entire room changed. What the hell does that mean? And why does my mom look like she's about to fall apart? Because whatever's about to come next. I don't think I'm ready for it. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. My mom's face had gone from anger to something else entirely. Panic. Like she had just realized there was no stopping this now. Mark leaned back in his chair, watching her with a slow smirk. "You gonna say it, or should I?" She didn't answer. He sighed, took another sip of his drink, and then dropped the bomb. "I was kicked out because I was in love with someone I wasn't supposed to be with." He turned to me, and for the first time, his voice softened. "I was in love with a man. I froze. A pin could have dropped in that room, and it would have sounded like an explosion. I looked at my mom, expecting some kind of denial, some angry outburst, but she just stood there, shaking. Mark continued, voice bitter. Mom and Dad found out first. They didn't take it well, but they were willing to keep me in the family, as long as I fixed it. He scoffed. You know, went to church, found the right girl, that kind of **T. I was still stunned silent. My grandparents had always been strict, traditional, but to kick their own son out over it? Then Mark turned to my parents, and his eyes darkened. But it wasn't just them, was it? My mom's jaw clenched. You don't understand. No, he cut her off. You don't understand. You and Dad gave them an ultimatum. You said if they let me stay, you'd cut them out of your lives. You were willing to take their only grandchild away from them just to make sure I was gone. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I turned to my parents. Is that true? Dad still wouldn't look at me. My mom let out a sharp breath. We did what was best for the family. I stared at her, my chest tightening. Best for who? She looked at me like I was the crazy one. You don't get it. You were just a baby. You needed a stable family. You needed a stable family? Mark snapped. You mean one where I didn't exist? Mom's hands were trembling now. We were protecting you. I shook my head, a sick feeling creeping up my spine. No, Mom. You were protecting yourselves. She opened her mouth, but for the first time, she had nothing to say. Mark let out a breath and stood up. You wanted me erased? Congratulations. You got your wish. He grabbed his coat and turned to me. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. But at least now, you know who they really are. And then, just like that, he walked out. I barely noticed. I was still staring at my parents, feeling something break between us. Because Mark wasn't the only thing they erased. They erased the truth. And I don't think I can ever look at them the same way again. How the hell do I even process this? The door slammed behind Mark, but the silence he left behind felt louder than any explosion. I just sat there, staring at my parents, my mind racing. They had done this. They had chosen to erase him. They had threatened to cut off my grandparents, the people they still pretended to love, just to make sure Mark was gone. And for what? Because they were more worried about how it looked than about their own family? Mom exhaled sharply and finally sat back down. She rubbed her temples like she was the victim here. Like this whole thing was just an inconvenience. I know you're upset, she started. I laughed. Actually laughed. Upset? No, Mom. Upset is when someone eats your leftovers. This is something else. Dad finally spoke, voice low. It's complicated. No, it's not. I turned to him. He was your brother. And you threw him away like he was nothing. Mom's face hardened. We did what was necessary. That set me off. Necessary for who? For me. Because guess what? I had a right to know I had an uncle. I had a right to know my own family. She shook her head, frustrated. You were a child. We had to make a choice. A choice, I repeated, my voice cold. Yeah. And you chose wrong. Mom stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Watch your tone. I laughed again, shaking my head. Or what? You'll erase me too. She went completely still. Dad exhaled sharply. This isn't fair. You don't understand what it was like back then. I don't care, I shot back. I don't care if it was back then. I don't care if it was 50 years ago. You both still made a choice, and now you just sit here like you're the ones who were wronged. Mom crossed her arms. He's telling you his version of the story. You don't know everything. I leaned forward. Then tell me, Mom. Tell me what part of this makes you the good guy. She didn't answer. Because she couldn't. After a long silence, I stood up and grabbed my coat. Where are you going? Dad asked. I turned to him. To talk to Mark. I looked at Mom. You already had 15 years to tell me your side of the story. And you wasted it. And with that, I walked out. I wasn't sure where I stood with my parents anymore. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them erase the truth again. I'm about to hear Mark's side of things. What if it's even worse than I thought? I found Mark sitting on the hood of his car, smoking a cigarette. He looked up when he saw me, exhaled a cloud of smoke, and shook his head. Well, he muttered. That went about as bad as I expected. I didn't know what to say. My whole life, he had just been the cool, distant uncle. The one who showed up once in a while but never stayed long. I never questioned it. Because they made sure I didn't. I leaned against the car next to him. I don't even know where to start. He took another drag. You don't have to say anything. You just found out your parents are a **** holes. That's a lot to process. I let out a sharp breath. So, it's true. They gave Grandma and Grandpa an ultimatum. Mark nodded. Yep. Me or them. And you already know how that turned out. I swallowed hard. What happened after you left? He flicked ash onto the pavement. Lived with a friend for a while. Then I left town. Tried to start over. Didn't have a choice. He let out a small, bitter laugh. Funny thing is, Mom and Dad didn't even want to kick me out at first. But your parents, they pushed for it. Said they wouldn't raise their child in a toxic environment. I clenched my jaw. By toxic, they meant you. Bingo. He gave me a sideways look. Guess I should have figured they never told you. Hell, they don't even acknowledge I exist unless they have to. I stared at the pavement, my hands in fists. They took him away from me. They chose to cut him out of my life before I even got the chance to know him. And they did it thinking they'd never have to face the consequences. Mark sighed and stubbed out his cigarette. Look, I'm not telling you this to turn you against them. But you deserve to know the truth. I do, I muttered. But they sure as hell didn't want me to. Silence stretched between us. Then Mark turned to me and said something I wasn't expecting. I don't care if you still have a relationship with them. I frowned. What? He shrugged. They're still your parents. You don't owe me anything. You don't have to pick sides. I shook my head. That's not how this works. Because this wasn't just some small mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. They erased a whole person from my life. And they did it so well, I wouldn't have ever known if I hadn't opened my mouth at dinner. Mark studied my face, then sighed. Look, all I'm saying is, whatever you do next, make sure it's what you want. Not what they want. Not what I want. You. I nodded slowly, but in my head, I already knew. I wasn't done with this yet. Not even close. Do I confront my parents again? Do I bring this up to my grandparents? One way or another, they don't get to just bury this. I sat in my car for a long time after leaving Mark. I should have driven home, but the thought of walking back into that house, back to them, made my skin crawl. My parents expected this to blow over. They thought that by the time I cooled down, I'd come crawling back, ready to move forward, and pretend none of this ever happened. But they didn't get to decide that anymore. I grabbed my phone, hesitated, and then did something I never thought I'd do. I called my grandparents. My grandmother picked up on the second ring. Sweetheart, this is a surprise. Everything okay? No, nothing was okay. But I didn't say that. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, Grandma, can I come over? I need to talk to you and Grandpa about something. She hesitated. Of course, dear. Is something wrong? I'll explain when I get there. I could hear the worry in her voice, but she didn't push. All right, we'll be here. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in their living room, hands clenched into fists, feeling like I was about to set off a bomb. Grandpa was watching me closely. What's this about? I swallowed hard. It's about Mark. Something changed in the room. My grandmother's smile faltered. Grandpa's jaw tightened. They exchanged a quick glance, one that confirmed everything before I even said another word. They already knew. I exhaled sharply. Why did you let them do it? Grandma flinched like I had slapped her. Grandpa was the one who answered. His voice was low, tired. It wasn't that simple. I let out a cold laugh. It was for them. They gave you a choice, him or them. Grandma's eyes filled with tears. We thought we were doing the right thing. We thought we'd still have a chance to fix it. Fix it? My voice came out sharp. You mean fix him? She didn't answer. I shook my head. You didn't just lose him. I lost him. You let them erase him from my life. Tears spilled down Grandma's face. I regret it every day. I wanted to believe her. Maybe part of me did. But regret doesn't undo the damage. I turned to Grandpa. And you? His face was hard. He didn't cry. He just looked at me and said, I made a mistake. And I live with it. That was it. No excuses. No defenses. Just reality. And for some reason, that made me angrier than anything. Because if they knew it was a mistake, if they really regretted it, then why did they never do anything to fix it? I stood up abruptly. I need to go. Grandma grabbed my hand, eyes desperate. Please, don't let this break our family. I looked at her. Really looked at her. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if this family was even worth saving. I drove around for over an hour after leaving my grandparents' house. I had nowhere to go, but I couldn't go home. Not yet. Everything felt fake now. Every childhood memory, every family gathering, it was all built on a lie. My grandparents regretted it? Fine. But regret is easy when you don't have to live with the consequences. Mark did. And so did I, without even knowing it. And my parents, they didn't regret a damn thing. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was late. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. My mom was sitting at the table, waiting. I walked past her without a word. Stop. I kept walking. Sit down. I let out a sharp laugh. Oh, we're giving orders now? She exhaled slowly. I know you're angry. No, I said, turning back. You don't know. You can't even begin to understand what I'm feeling right now. She rubbed her temples. You went to see Mark, didn't you? I folded my arms. And Grandma and Grandpa. Her head snapped up. For the first time, she looked nervous. Why would you do that? I narrowed my eyes. Why? Because you stole my family from me and expected me to just accept it. You still have your family, she snapped. I laughed. Actually laughed. No, Mom. I have whatever this is. A version of our family that only exists because you decided what was acceptable and erased everything else. Her hands clenched into fists. We were protecting you. From what? I shouted. From the fact that my uncle exists. From the fact that he fell in love with someone you didn't approve of. Her face twisted. It was more complicated than that. No, it wasn't. My voice was cold now. You're just too much of a coward to admit it. Her nostrils flared. Watch your mouth. Or what? I stepped forward. You'll erase me too? Her face went pale. She didn't answer. I let the silence sit between us for a moment before I spoke again. I don't trust you, I said, my voice quieter now. I don't think I ever will again. Something in her cracked. Her shoulders sagged, her face crumpling in a way I'd never seen before. Like she realized, maybe for the first time, that she had actually lost. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't care anymore. She could argue, justify, lie, but it didn't matter. She had already lost me. I turned and walked to my room. She didn't stop me this time. I don't know where we go from here, but I know one thing. I'm done letting them rewrite the past. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No banging around in the kitchen. No forced morning greetings. Just nothing. I wasn't sure if that was better or worse. I stayed in bed longer than usual, scrolling through my phone, trying to pretend my life hadn't completely fallen apart in the last 24 hours. But it didn't work. My brain wouldn't shut up. I finally got up and made my way downstairs. My dad was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee. He looked up when he saw me, but he didn't say anything. Mom wasn't there. I grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Where is she? Dad sighed. Went to Grandma's. That surprised me. Why? She's upset. He paused. She thinks she lost you. I scoffed. She didn't lose me. She threw me away the second she decided what I was allowed to know. Dad stared into his coffee, swirling the mug in slow circles. It wasn't an easy decision. I clenched my jaw. Stop defending it. He rubbed his face. I'm not. He sighed, shaking his head. Look, I know we **** up. But we thought we were doing the right thing. I slammed my glass down on the counter. For who? Dad flinched but didn't answer. I exhaled, shaking my head. You could have told me the truth at any point. Any point. But you didn't. Dad finally looked up at me. Would it have changed anything? That hit me in a weird way. Would it? If I had grown up knowing about Mark, knowing about what happened, would I have hated them earlier? Would I have fought them on it? Would I have left? I didn't know. But that wasn't the point. That's not your call to make, I muttered. It never was. Dad sighed again and stood up, rinsing out his mug. He looked tired, defeated. But part of me couldn't bring myself to care. "I need time," he said finally. I let out a sharp laugh. "Time for what?" "To figure out how to spin this in your favor." He shook his head. "Time to figure out if you'll ever forgive us." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. I didn't have an answer for that. Because right now, I wasn't sure if I ever could. I left the house. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. I just needed out. Away from my dad's tired excuses, away from my mom's manipulations, away from the rotting foundation my family had been built on. Somehow, I ended up at Mark's place. He raised an eyebrow when he opened the door. "That bad, huh?" I stepped inside without answering. He didn't push. Just grabbed 2 beers from the fridge, tossed me one, and sat on the couch. I took a sip, trying to organize my thoughts. "Mom thinks she lost me." Mark snorted. "Yeah, well, actions have consequences." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Dad says he needs time." Mark let out a sharp laugh. "For what?" "To figure out how to sleep at night." I shook my head. "To see if I'll ever forgive them." That made him pause. His expression shifted, like he wasn't sure if he should say what he was thinking. But then he sighed. "You don't have to." I frowned. "What?" He set his beer down. "You don't have to forgive them. There's no rule that says you have to fix this just because they're your parents." I exhaled. "They're still my family." Mark's jaw tightened. "They were mine too." That shut me up. I looked at him, really looked at him. This was a man who had lived his entire adult life knowing that the people who were supposed to love him chose to erase him. And yet, here he was. Still standing. Still whole. I realized something then. He had survived without them. I could too. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know what to do next." Mark shrugged. "You don't have to know yet. Just don't let them trick you into thinking this is your mess to clean up." I closed my eyes, letting those words settle. Because for the first time, I realized, it's not my job to fix what they broke. I don't know if I can ever forgive them. And maybe, that's okay. I didn't go home that night. I crashed at Mark's place instead. He didn't make a big deal about it, didn't ask questions, just tossed me a pillow and went to bed. And honestly, that was the most family-like thing anyone had done for me in days. The next morning, I woke up to a text from my mom. "Mom, we need to talk. Please come home." I stared at the screen for a long time. I could go back. I could sit through another one of her carefully crafted speeches, full of excuses and half-truths, and let her tell me why I should just let it go. Or, I could make a choice. My own choice. I got up, grabbed my keys, and walked to the door. Mark was making coffee, and he glanced up when he saw me. "You heading out?" I nodded. "Back home?" he asked carefully. I thought about it. Thought about sitting at that kitchen table, listening to my parents act like this could still be repaired. Thought about pretending. And then, for the first time in my life, I put myself first. "No," I said. "Not yet." Mark just nodded, like he already knew that was coming. Good. I didn't know where I was going. But I knew where I wasn't going. I wasn't going back to people who only wanted me on their terms. Who thought love was conditional. Who erased someone from my life and expected me to just accept it. Maybe one day, I'd be ready to talk. Maybe one day, I'd hear them out. But today, they don't get to control the story anymore. That's it. That's the whole mess. I don't know where things go from here. But for the first time, it's my choice. That's it for today's story. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more wild Reddit stories. Until next time, stay curious and keep the stories coming.